Stanford University.
Bob is one of the world's leading researchers on online communities, and he'll be talking to us about how social theories can be applied to hopefully better design online communities. And today I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Will Wight, who probably needs little introduction. He's the designer of games such as SimCity, The Sims, and Spore, and he's come to talk to us today about some of his approaches to design and maybe a bit about Spore and online communities as well. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Will Wight.
Hi everybody, I'm not sure if this mic is working. Can everybody hear me okay?
It's to record, not
to okay. So you don't get the mic. We could bring the lights down a little bit too if we could, just help you see the slides a little bit better. I wasn't sure what to talk about. I was going to come and talk about a lot of kind of abstract design stuff, but then I looked at the website at Stanford and it said I was talking about Spore. So I thought I would try and keep it at least a little bit on topic. So I'm mostly going to be talking about Spore stuff, kind of more as a post-mortem to some degree, but also giving some insight into kind of how we approached the design from the outset. You know, whenever I work on a project, it goes through a number of different phases, really kind of in my own mind. You know, typically when game designers get together and talk about what they're doing and share kind of experiences with each other, it's basically on these last four things. It's really once you get into the production of the idea. But for me, really, it's the early part that I enjoy the most, and that's where I probably overinvest too much of my time, is on the, the concept and research side of it. So I thought I would cover a little bit of that here, which is a little bit different than you typically hear in kind of game design talks. The whole idea of game research seems kind of odd, in a kind of oxymoron type of way. But a lot of the games I've worked on, in fact, were inspired by reading. I read a lot, and books, typically nonfiction books, tend to inspire ideas as I read them. I'm really taken by how interesting these subjects are, but yet they're kind of hidden in this academic language to where they're not accessible to average people, but yet the ideas that they're kind of espousing are very interesting to the average person if you can just put it in the right words. Or in my case, I try to put it into a play experience, or turn these ideas, these concepts, into toys, which become games. The Sims, one of the early inspirations was a book by Christopher Alexander, Pattern Language, which I imagine a number of you have probably read or seen. But that, really would be the starting point for any one of these ideas. Basically, I'll branch out from that and look at every other subject that might have some kind of input into that. And so The Sims ended up, studying. We actually had a feng shui simulator at some point in the game. We did a lot of, psychology, how mimes communicate, because the Sims don't talk, so they had to communicate a lot of their state through, body expression. Why people shop. It turned out that the shopping part of The Sims was one of the, easiest handles for average people to get into in the first 5 minutes. They'd look at all this architecture stuff, the psychology stuff, but then they'd open the shopping catalog. Oh, I see, I can buy a toaster oven or a big screen TV. And they understood that. And, as they were browsing the shopping catalog, they started getting a sense, the ratings on the items, this is entertainment +5, comfort +2. So by browsing the shopping, they actually learned what the adjectives, they learned the data structures that underlie the psychology of The Sims through a much more familiar kind of activity. When I get into games, there's this Japanese phrase called otaku, which I imagine a lot of people at Stanford have probably heard this term before, but it's basically a fairly derisive term in Japan, which means a really overly enthusiastic fan about something. Otaku is somebody that's like totally into this, particular anime or manga. But I find that when I get into a subject on the research side, I find it really valuable. I really want to develop my inner otaku, where I want to just totally get immersed in a subject to the point where it's obsessive to me. And I just cannot get enough of that. Now, one of the things I found looking at what players do with these games, more and more they want to be expressive. You want to give them larger and larger areas within the game to do weird, surprising, shocking, funny things, especially things that they can share with other people. We saw that a lot with The Sims. Players found exploits, they found cheats, they downloaded stuff, they made new content, just to kind of bring the game in all sorts of ridiculous areas. In some sense, it's kind of their way of getting more ownership over the experience. And then it becomes kind of a tool of self-expression for them. That became one of the kind of major inspirations for Spore, is how do we give players more range of expressiveness within the game? How do we give them more stuff to do, more stuff to create in an easier way? Thematically, it was inspired by a couple of other things. First of all, the Powers of 10 idea, which was a book and a film by Charles and Ray Eames, that some of you may have seen. Made, originally in the early 60s, they did the black and white film, later a book and a color film in the 70s. The concept was actually originated by a guy named Kees Boeke, a Dutch school teacher, that wrote this book, Cosmic View, back in 1957. And he actually, pretty much the same idea. He started with like a lady holding a baby, and as he zoomed out, there was larger items, very kind of strange pictures. But he in fact had his students do all the images. So the Eameses didn't actually originate this concept. But another big inspiration for Spore was the whole concept of astrobiology, which is a fairly new science. It's basically kind of looking through, the universe and trying to discern the, probability of aliens being out there or life, which is a really interesting question because I found that this is a question that scientists are taking more and more seriously, A, but B, it's also a concept that a 5-year-old can totally understand and is interested in. And that range of things that, it's a science where there's a lot of interesting work, happening right now, and a 5-year-old can understand what it's about, is a really good indicator of of an area that has broad kind of meaning. One of the fundamental ideas of astrobiology is trying to estimate, what is the probability of life out in the universe. Drake's equation, Frank Drake came up with this idea that we should be able to estimate that if we knew what certain factors were. And in Drake's equation, the factors are things like the number of stars out there, times the number of planets around every star, times the number of those that have life, times those that become intelligent, etc. I found that the terms in Drake's equation actually map across all the different scales. They work. Some are at the physics scale, chemistry, biology, all the way up to astronomy. So in some sense, the terms in Drake's equation span the powers of 10 idea from the Eameses. Most of the combinations are pretty boring if you kind of sit there and play with the sliders. Also, but we're getting a lot of data now about some of these sliders that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago. Extrasolar planets, for instance, and also some kind of microbial life stuff that we're learning. One of the early concepts of Spore really was perhaps the player would be in the role of trying to green the galaxy. What if you were playing with Drake's equation and trying to up those factors and basically trying to see intelligent life out there, which is pretty much the backstory of 2001: Space Odyssey. But as we looked at this and we started, we start with very kind of abstract ideas like this, academic ideas, then we start trying to find a handle on this. What would a person find fun about this? What can we turn into a game? What is the decision point that we want to put the player in? Because every game really, what makes it compelling is that you put the player in a role of having to make interesting decisions where it's not really clear what the right answer is. And then they get to basically see the outcome, the repercussions of those decisions that they make. One of the big blanks in Drake's equation is the probability of life. In science, that's still a huge unknown, is the origin of life on Earth. We have a lot of very elaborate theories. For the most part, most of these theories are kind of like this old Far Side thing, where, a miracle is invoked somewhere. But we started kind of diving into that very early on in Spore, trying to figure out, should the origin of life be a central part of the game? We actually started doing these elaborate little simulations of things like autocatalytic sets and, metabolisms and, kind of cellular networks. And we actually built about 6 different prototypes of these systems and showed them to a lot of people. And because they were basically molecules and very elaborate systems that they were not familiar with, could not map their intuitions in, we decided to punt. And in this case, punting meant going with the panspermia theory, which is the idea that life came to Earth from externally. Basically, we're not going to deal with the origin of life in Spore. The game starts with a comet landing on your planet, and you actually start with your first microbe. And so really, Spore became more about evolution, progression through, intelligence, spacefaring, etc. A big aspect in game design, kind of at every level, is how much do we try to deal with fact versus fiction? And it's a really interesting balance, because a lot of times we will simulate things in a game the way people would expect it to work, not the way it really works. And we do that, for very specific reasons. In SimCity, if your nuclear power plant, caught on fire or something bad happened to it, it would just, go nuclear. It would blow up, which doesn't happen in nuclear power plants. They might release a little radiation, but they don't blow up like a hydrogen bomb. But yet everybody, that played it expected that to happen, so we ended up changing it so that it did happen. And in some sense, it's kind of candy. Other parts of the game we try to be fairly realistic with, like in SimCity, the traffic patterns and stuff are fairly realistic, but they're also counterintuitive in an interesting way. There's kind of an old saying in city planning that roads don't solve traffic, they breed it. And if you play SimCity for a while, you start kind of getting that sense very subtly over time. As you keep building more roads, pretty much they fill up with traffic and people move further away from the central city. So it's certain things where we're basically trying to basically match their expectations of unreality. Other ones where we're trying to surprise them with reality in a fun, counterintuitive way. When Rod Serling did Twilight Zone back in the 60s, he was actually saying at the time that his was the only show on television that dealt with reality, which was interesting because there were a lot of hot-button topics back then, civil rights issues, etc., that none of the other television networks would touch, with drama, with serious drama. Whereas all he had to do was, make it about an alien and an earthling trying to, live together peacefully. And he could basically tell stories about the real issues of the day by setting it in a fictional area that it didn't feel threatening and it felt kind of more playful. In some sense, science fiction has kind of always served that purpose. In some sense, it's been able to put up kind of warnings of futures that we might want to avoid, landmarks, but also in a way to where we can take it into a playful realm. It's not something that feels like an academic paper. It's something that we can sit there in our mind and turn around in our imagination and have talks about. And there's something about taking serious concepts into a playful realm that I think is really valuable. As we thought about Spore, and we have this universe that we're building, people are going to be going out and exploring it. One of the things that, almost like the nuclear power plant blowing up in SimCity, the expectation is that you really want to go out there and meet lots of interesting aliens. Whether or not that's realistic, that's like the very first thing people imagine when they think of, Star Trek or Star Wars or anything like that, any kind of science fiction. So really early on, we decided it was kind of about the aliens. That was one of the emotional hooks that we had to kind of give players the handle that we gave them to grab onto the idea. This is why they want to come in and do this. So we spent a lot of time thinking about all the different aliens that we've seen in science fiction, fantasy, etc. Now there's a really interesting overlap. I've always been interested in both aliens and robots for the same reason, it turns out, really. Only when you try to build, a robotic implementation of some human ability do you tend to realize how wonderful that human ability is. Something as simple, seemingly as simple as the human hand, when you try to recreate it in a machine, you realize what an incredible mechanism the human hand is. Intelligence in a similar way, kind of in AI. So when I was about 7 years old, my parents took me to see this movie, and it just blew me away as a 7-year-old. Still my favorite movie of all time. It was, the first time I had really thought about computers, and of course HAL in 2001 was this homicidal computer. But more than that, HAL was this intelligent computer. It was like a person, and they had relationships with it and conversations and stuff. And it just, the idea of machine intelligence was utterly fascinating to me. It was interesting when people saw the movie 2001. They came out of the theater saying to each other, "I can't believe that computer beat the guy at chess." Whereas they took for granted the fact that it could have natural conversations and, connive and do all this stuff, even lip reading. Of course it can lip read, but beat him at chess, that requires intelligence, So continually as we explore aliens, and robots and AI, I think, what in some sense these things are really doing is they're redefining, what humanity is, what our abilities are, what's hard and what's easy about them. If we look at aliens, aliens really represent all different aspects of what we think of as humanity. We have very nice, beneficent aliens. We have very mean, scary aliens. We have very smart aliens, very stupid aliens. In some sense, they're kind of triangulating all the range of, what we think of as humanity. So really, aliens and robots really, I think, are a lens on humanity. As we think about these things, we are basically exploring our own abilities, what it means to be human. We're building models of humanity with both of these things. And, in my games, really, that's what I do. I build models to help understand systems. When you build a caricature, a simplified representation of a system, and have to get it to work, and actually have to have it be self-consistent and formally represented within the computer, it's amazing the insights. It basically ends up spotlighting your ignorance on that system. When your model doesn't match reality, or the data it's generating diverges, way off to left field, you realize, I'm not taking something into account. There's something I'm missing, And then typically that's the way science is working more and more now. It used to be that you'd come up with a hypothesis, you would design an experiment to test the hypothesis. Now more and more it's you come up with a hypothesis and now you build a model to test it and see if the model can recreate the data that you're observing in reality. If you're not, then your hypothesis is flawed, your model is flawed in some way. And so in some sense these models really are spotlights on our ignorance. And they help us kind of pinpoint where we need to go in and understand the system, at a higher level. There were a lot of psychological kind of aspects to, aliens, I think, rising in our popular culture as well. We've had kind of reports of alien visitation, all the way back through the centuries. World War II even, they had, kind of the more technical reports of these Foo Fighters that were following fighter planes. But it was really after the atomic bombs dropped that aliens became front and center in kind of the collective human psyche. The Roswell incident was just after that. And really, aliens, I think, in some sense, represented this latent fear that we had about what we had become, humanity. We had the ability for the very first time to destroy our entire planet. And so we kind of manifest that originally, in aliens. What if in some sense, it's like the aliens were ourselves, were our ability for destruction. And in some sense, we started yearning for aliens that were more powerful than us. Hopefully there's something out there more powerful and especially wiser than us. So, but at the same time, we tend to represent aliens as very physically vulnerable. They get their, godlike powers through their technology, which is the path we were on. But at the same time, they, are very fragile little biological entities. So in some sense, I think we were kind of yearning for some adult supervision, that all of a sudden we discovered matches, and we knew we shouldn't be playing with matches, but we had matches, and we're hoping there's an adult around. But so I think there are a lot of really interesting psychological, reasons why aliens have become such a big part of kind of modern mythos and modern culture. Now, back on the game side, I spent a lot of time, doing research on concepts, thinking through, ideas like this. What makes them interesting? How broad are the concepts? What are the reasons why we want to go in and kind of play with these systems? From that, we tend to start building a lot of simulations and prototypes. Originally, the simulations are more kind of specific. Can we simulate a galaxy? Can we simulate an autocatalytic set? Over time, once we find interesting dynamics and interesting levels to simulate systems, we start developing deeper prototypes, which are more in gameplay. Now we start adding more of the interactive component. We let a person come in and start modifying it. We start putting goal sets on top of it. So we're now taking these simple little toy models of reality and giving the player, an input. Basically a way to poke the ant pile with a stick and play with the ants and see what they do with these things. What are the goals that they want to pursue? What are the things they find challenging and interesting? What occurs to them? And we'll iterate those a lot. We'll actually play with these gameplay prototypes. We'll test them on people who have no idea what we're working on. Just ask them, do you play with this for a while? Do you find it fun? Based upon that, we will actually go back and do new research. And there's kind of this whole loop that's going on between these three things here. Now, we do research. I end up way over-researching a subject. Typically only about 10 to 20% of the research I do ends up in the game. But that's very important because you want to get the right 20% in that game. And so it's kind of a given that there's going to be a fairly high reduction there of the domains of things that could be in the game versus the distillation of what you actually end up putting in the game. The way I think about it as a designer is that we're exploring this huge design tree, with lots and lots of branches. At some point, we're going to be on some leaf way out here. We don't know what leaf we're going to be at the end of this tree, but there are a lot of branches on the way there. And what we're trying to do is most intelligently explore the branches, basically prune the branches early on as quickly as possible that we're not going to take, and not waste a whole lot of time exploring untaken branches. And the way we explore these differs depending on what it is. Sometimes it'll be research, sending it off in a certain direction. Other times we'll build a prototype, we'll test the prototype. Then we might talk to people and interview them, based upon that and take a different branch. It might be more user testing. That might send us back and actually pulling other old games off the shelf and, checking those out. So really it's a combination of techniques that we're exploring this design tree with. But at every branch, what our basic goal is to pick the right direction. There's always kind of an instinct as to, I don't know exactly what leaf I want to be at the end of this project, but I do know I want to head in roughly that direction. When we get to these branches, we want to say we don't want to spend too much time on basically a dead branch, a branch that we're not going to take. So what's the most effective way to mitigate our exploration there? Is it in a prototype? Is it in user testing? Is it in research, etc.? So on the early questions, usually at the very base of this tree, very early on, I tend to ask myself, a set of broad questions. How much innovation is there involved in this project and what is it? What are the primary risks of the project? What's the obvious fun that, just right off the bat makes me, draws me in to the idea? And what are the messages I want to convey to the player, which becomes kind of a guiding principle through the whole thing. Basically when a player comes and plays this game for a while, they walk away 3 hours later, I want them to see the world a little bit differently. And how is it that I want them to see it differently? I want to actually change their model of the way the world works to some degree. Now, innovation doesn't really always guarantee success, and we've seen a lot of examples of that. Sometimes it does. One thing that it does do is it helps get above the signal to noise in the marketplace. If people recognize that you're coming out with something very fresh and innovative, at least people will turn around and look at it and give it a chance. And in entertainment marketing, that's really a big deal. There's a huge amount of noise in the entertainment industry. And so any advantage you can get there helps. But now innovation carries a cost as well. It means you're going to be going down, a set of unexplored, design branches, and you have to take into account that you're going to spend a lot of wasted effort, well, not really wasted effort, but a lot of extra effort going down branches that you're going to want to prune intelligently to explore this basically unexplored landscape. Entertainment is very much a hit-driven industry, and innovation is one of the things that can kind of get you up, kind of above the radar. Now, on project risks, there are a lot of ways at looking at risk, and when we look at risks, on a project-wide basis, they can come in a lot of different forms. Sometimes they're technology risks, other times they're design risks, production risks. Sometimes it's marketing or political risks within your organization as you're trying to pitch this idea. Any one of these things can sink your project. And so as a designer, I tried to think of this whole palette of risks and triage them and say, what is the biggest risk that we faced and how do we basically manage it? Within electronic arts, after a while, a few years ago, basically when people came up with a game idea, they'd kind of go to the executives and say, here's the game I want to do. It's going to be great. It's going to be about da 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 da. And people started realizing that all the executives were playing World of Warcraft, basically. And so people realized that, to pitch your project, you have to go in and say, oh, it's just like World of Warcraft, except we're racing cars in the future with guns or whatever it is, and that was like the most effective way to mitigate that risk within that group. For Spore, we had a lot of, the top risks, and these were pretty much the way we saw it from the very beginning of the project. Because we wanted the players to be able to create an unlimited number of weird creatures, we had to animate them procedurally. We could not take the typical approach, and that was a huge technical risk for us. The usability editors, we wanted to have a different level of people being able to create new models that didn't really exist, and so that was really kind of a design risk. The scope of it, the idea that we were simulating the universe at all these different scales, was a definite risk. The pollinated content, which is the way the players, stuff that they make gets on other people's machines kind of transparently, was kind of an unknown. And the content pipeline as well, because the fact that we were having to generate our own animations and our own meshes and models meant that we were basically throwing away most of what, like Electronic Arts has a very established pipeline within the company of doing animations and models and stuff like that, and we basically were not using any of that. We had to roll our own content pipeline. So for each one of these, we were kind of like categorizing what the risks were. 2 of these were design risks, 2 of these were technology risks, and 1 was a production risk. Within each one of these risks, we then go in and we start exploring, like on the procedural animation, we started studying other examples of procedural animation, brought in people that had actually worked on them, people that had experience, giving us a sense of what was the scope of that problem, how solvable was it, and we had to basically decide, could we solve this or not, before we invested, lots and lots of money in the project. So this is very early on. The very first 2 team members I brought into the project were to, basically determine, can we crack this problem? And once we determined that we could, then we proceeded with the rest of the risk analysis. Pollinated content, we actually were learning a lot from The Sims, and that really helped mitigate that. Design scope, most games are, tend to be fairly simple systems. Some games look more like that. In some sense, Spore really was decided we would cut it up into a number of different levels, make every level fairly simple, but the whole thing could be overwhelming if you presented it all at once. But really, we gave kind of a linear presentation where every time you played one level of the game, you were learning basically a little bit about how to play the next level. And so that was one of the ways that we tried to mitigate that risk in the design scope. Plus, we played a lot of other games that involve space and exploration and generative systems. And we did lots and lots of prototypes. We did, over 200 different prototypes of gameplay, technology, simulation within Spore in the first few years before we actually started writing production code. These prototypes, again, we write these as we're exploring this branching design tree, and only a small number of those are going to go in the game. But there are a lot of ways that you can kind of mitigate that risk as well. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time, had really good luck with, is interns. Interns coming in for the summer, they have a few months. When we do prototypes, we actually try to do prototypes that we can have up and running within a week. When I say prototype, I don't mean something that we spend a month working on. Really, if it takes longer than a week to build a prototype, it's probably not worth the time you're spending on it. And we have very specific questions that we try to answer with these prototypes. When we start a prototype, we say, we want to find out if this is interesting, or can we simulate this with this many cycles, or can an average person come in and figure out how this works. So we have very specific questions that we're asking with these prototypes, and very specific constrained timescales in which we try to build and use them. On the editor usability, we actually, we're basically trying to create Maya that a 6-year-old could use. And there was some work in really easy to use editing systems out there that of course we studied. But this is something that was very much a UI challenge for us through the whole project. And in fact, most of the really deep AI in Spore is in the editor. When you're moving things around like in the creature editor, the really hard part with 3D editing is determining the Z that the user intends, because you have a two-dimensional input device, a two-dimensional screen, but yet you are trying to triangulate something in three-dimensional space. And so when you're dealing with Maya or something, you leave it up to the user to determine what the Z coordinate is, and there's some kind of constrained control where you're modally going to a different axis. In Spore, we actually built statistical clouds around the creature with a lot of heuristic knowledge of what it thought you were trying to do, and it would actually try to guess the Z underneath the hood, which is why the creature editor and the other editors seem fairly easy to use, because the Z, for the most part, is the AI controlling it in Spore. Now with any system, we saw with the Sims that whenever we gave people tools to make stuff that they were going to share, put in their games, that we had this very characteristic kind of curve where we had lots and lots of stuff that you would just kind of charitably call crappy. Some of it that was okay, a little bit pretty good, and a very small amount that was really great. This kind of power law distribution of quality versus content. One of our big kind of aspirations with Spore was, could we pull up this far end of the curve, the long tail, so the area of stuff that we got under the high quality content was much higher, by basically giving the tools, having the tools give the player more leverage as they were doing stuff in the game. Now, we spent a lot of time in design, with these editors. Probably we went through about 15 different complete iterations, totally different models of how the user was thinking about this, how they were manipulating the camera, manipulating the objects, etc. And that, so we probably spent about 4 years, doing lots and lots of usability testing on those things. And that was when we just kind of basically had to attack with brute force, design brute force. The content pipeline, Electronic Arts was using Renderware, which basically provided animation and modeling. We had very deep pixel shaders that we actually were able to use. But we kind of had to approach our art in a very different way, because in Spore we were, most of the content you're actually interacting with and seeing in Spore is generative at some level. Either the players made it or the computer's generating it. For instance, the planets are all generated based on a 32-bit seed. So. And it's a very wide range of planets, and they're very detailed, very large planets that are generated from a 32-bit seed, which means they're highly compressible, but it puts a lot more load on the artist and the way they have to think about these things, because an artist is not sitting there basically creating this entire planet. Basically, our artist's process really came into how to observe systems like this, whether it be a planet, a creature, buildings, vehicles, whatever. In somewhat of a scientific sense, what are the underlying principles of this thing, and then deconstruct it and conceptualize it in a more abstract sense. That abstraction we would actually use to create our data structures. How are we going to think about creatures? How are we going to think about planets? The planets actually had this very deep, almost kind of geological underpinning, that these are where the ravines are, this is where the watershed is, this is where the trees should be. But then we use these data structures to go back into a regenerative phase to where we can algorithmically now regenerate the content. So our artists on Spore, for the most part, were doing this rather than sitting there in a modeling program, building a planet. They were actually deconstructing real systems, trying to figure out what the abstractions, what the data structures were, so the programmers could then algorithmically recreate it with the right look. So we spent a lot of time basically building the tool set for this process for our artists. So almost all of our artists programmed at some level, and they were actually programming a lot of the generative systems as well. Now the obvious fun, in Spore, originally I conceived it primarily as you have a spaceship and you're flying around, and the hook is, how fun would it be, to have your little spaceship and be able to fly around to all these hundreds of planets? And what would you do? Basically you're on a joyride. You stole your dad's spaceship and you're off having fun. We went through every level of the game that we figured the player would be coming up through, just kind of imagining, what would you do on a wild planet? What would be fun to do, interact with, abduct aliens. One of my favorite old shows when I was a kid was, was it Mutual of Omaha's Wildlife Kingdom. And it was this kind of almost like nature show, but they were always off in Africa studying the gazelle or something. But every episode, and this is the reason I loved it, somehow, for some reason, always ended up with them in a helicopter with a big tranquilizer gun. basically chasing down some animal and having to shoot it with a tranquilizer gun. And that was really the cool part of the show. And so, for me, this was, kind of what the wild, that level of Spore. When I come down to a wild planet, I want to be there chasing, wild animals, abducting them, taking them off to do genetic experiments or whatever. On the tribal phase, we actually thought a lot about, okay, well, in some sense, you want these people to be worshiping you. You're coming in as a god, in your UFO. What is the gameplay you would want around that? I mean, in fact, go back and read a lot of science fiction stories and things where people, this is really, when I say obvious fun, this is what is going to occur to the average person. When you say you're in a spaceship and you're going to a tribal planet, what are you going to do? It's actually fairly repeatable, the scenarios that they will give you, and it's typically based upon popular fiction. Civilized planet, we have kind of first contact scenarios, we have the adult supervision scenario, and we have just kind of screwing with our heads scenario, and so all these things are things that we kind of wanted to be, available in the game. And then once you get up to the spacefaring and interacting with your peers, basically, it's either these elaborate kind of galactic wars, or maybe economic trading, or building a federation of alliances and whatnot, diplomacy. So in some sense, these were kind of our early landmarks as to what the gameplay would be at the different levels of the game as you explored the galaxy. Now the deep messages were the things that we wanted the player to kind of walk away from the game with after they had played it. What are they thinking about in their heads afterwards? When you're playing a game of any type, you're not really thinking about the code. You're thinking about an internal model in your head that you're building. In some sense, that model that you're building in your head is the real model. The game that we're building really is just a compiler for that mental model. That's the model we want to build, is in the player's head, because that's when the game really comes alive. These characters on screen really are just numbers in memory. But in your imagination, you're sitting there, especially if somebody walks away from a game and they're still playing it, then it's taken hold and it's actually running in their imagination pretty effectively. And the best games that I've really enjoyed are ones that when I leave the computer or the game system or whatever, an hour later I'm sitting there thinking about the game in my mind. What am I going to do next? Or what's my next move going to be? So I'm actually simulating the gameplay in my head away from the machine. And that means that, it's been successful. The compiler has built a running model in my imagination. This is one of my favorite quotes about education. And it's really the way I've, think about education more than anything else. People tend to accuse my games of being educational, and I kind of hope they're not. I'd much rather think of them as motivational, because I think that any kid has plenty of resources for finding out anything they want to on the internet. They have the equivalent of Library of Congress on their desktop. The hard part is getting them motivated and interested. How do you get them interested in these subjects so that they develop that passion, that kind of otaku-like obsession, and want to go out and learn about these things? They realize how cool it is. And so really, for me, that's always been my goal state. I kind of grew up going through a kind of constructivist education up to about 6th grade. I went to Montessori school, which was based on kind of earlier work by a German guy named Froebel, who had done constructivist methods with kids, basically where the kids are self-directed and they tend to be attracted to the things that they're interested in at the moment. And if they're interested in that thing, they will learn it very effectively, as opposed to the teacher going up and saying, today we're going to learn algebra, and then it kind of just washing over you. So in terms of what effect you want to have on the players, I've always wanted to give the players a lot of basically free will and let them drive the experience rather than me forcing stuff down them. My first thought on the deep messages that I wanted to convey in Spore, which in fact ended up being a little too esoteric, I wanted to I started with things like this, which were things that in my mind I was really interested in as I was doing Spore. And I think, for certain players, they kind of get very roughly the idea of the Copernican principle, because you're sitting there playing this game and you're, just this one little creature on this one little planet, and that's the whole world, and, everything else is revolving above you overhead. But at some point you get in a spaceship and you fly away and you realize that planet's just one little planet out of millions in the Spore universe. So I think that the players actually do, at some deep level, have this kind of dawning of the Copernican revolution, that they're not the center of the universe. Some of these other ones kind of fell more by the wayside as we started exposing people to this concept and having them play. We started realizing and asking them what they got out of it after they played. The messages that they were really getting were a little bit deeper in a different direction, but they were equally as valuable, I think. Number one is that we wanted to show that science was unitary. We tend to chop up science into this is geology, that's biology, that's chemistry. But really, science is really an attempt to understand the entire world at every level. We are artificially chopping it up into these different subjects. But Spore, doesn't say here's the chemistry section or here's the, social sciences section. It's fairly seamless in the way it presents this model of the universe. Another one is that life, is very diverse. It's one of the most amazing things about life is the diversity of it at every scale. And I think the diversity that the players were achieving, the stuff they were creating, when they make stuff, it actually gets shared to all the other players. And I'll talk a little bit about the numbers, but the numbers were huge, in Spore, much higher than real life, actually. I think one of the fundamental things that a lot of people got out of it, though, was that anybody can be creative. One of our aspirations that we wanted in a few minutes, a kid to be able to recreate a character like a Pixar artist would spend weeks on. Not quite to the same level, but in the ballpark. And I think that was really the biggest hook for a lot of people in the game. On the science side, I've always loved astronomy. I've always been disappointed in kind of the way it's taught. Typically, first thing you do is you get these star maps, or you see the planetarium depicting all the stars on the surface. Space is not flat; it's incredibly 3D, and that's like one of the most amazing things about it. But the way we typically tend to teach things like astronomy are here are the constellations and here's the ecliptic and all these things that are very two-dimensional concepts. Just now with like digital planetaria, I think we're getting more interesting ways to kind of convey and move around in this three-dimensional space and really give people a sense of the interesting dimensionality of it. Even in games, space games, where you have these elaborate galactic empires, the elaborate huge empire is maybe 100 planets. It turns out, galaxies are huge. They're immense, billions of stars. And so that was another big thing I really wanted to convey to people was that galaxies are much, much bigger than most people think. The number of stars in one galaxy is just, mind-boggling. And even our galaxy in Spore has about 2 million stars, which is a very, very minor fraction of what like the Milky Way has. But it was big enough, to really kind of convey to the players. Oh, this is my Russian space minute. I think we have time for this. This is a random diversion that I like doing occasionally because I get tired of talking about games and everybody always wants me to talk about games. So every now and then I talk about the stuff I really want to talk about. And one of my favorite subjects is the Russian space program, which nobody knows about, and it has like this amazing, cool history. Stuff that you just would not believe. So I'm going to tell you the story of Soyuz 23, which launched in October 1976. These two fellows that were actually from the military, not the civilian branch, were going up to the Salyut station. Now the Russians did this really amazing little shell game. They had this Salyut space station program that had 6 space stations that were launched. In fact, really only 3 of these were real Salyuts. The other 3 were Almaz stations, which were designed by the military, and they were basically these elaborate observatory battle stations. But they called it Salyut, and they looked about the same, were launched on the same boosters. The West didn't find about this till 20 years after it happened, so it was entirely successful from their point of view. One of the Almaz stations didn't make it to orbit, so really only 2 ended up in orbit. Well, what these were, though, were these basically manned spy satellites. They had these huge cameras on them, and as it was orbiting the Earth, they would task the cosmonauts to aim and photograph very specific installations as they went around the Earth. And they were manned by military crew. One of the projects that the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, was developing was the X-20 Dynastar at the time, and they really had no purpose for it. It was more the Air Force wanted to get a part of the space budget is what it was, and so they developed this little kind of space plane thing. And the Russians had gotten a whiff of the early plans of the Dynastar, and they decided that the reason the U.S. Air Force was building this was because they knew that the Almaz stations were in fact military satellites, and that they were planning to come shoot them down with these things. And so they were convinced that the U.S. were building interceptors to come shoot these down. So what they did is they turned these into battle stations. They actually had cannons on these things, 20 millimeter, modified anti-aircraft guns, bore-sighted on the space station to shoot down approaching U.S. fighters. Now, of course, when you think about it, if they fired this gun, it's going to cause a reaction and deorbit the station. So they had to tie it back into the reaction control system. Every time it fired a shell, it had to fire its thrusters to keep the station in orbit. And the cosmonauts were terrified of firing this. Because if the reaction control system got, malfunctioned, they'd deorbit themselves. But they only test fired it once, but they actually successfully killed a satellite, 3 kilometers away with it, first try. Now, they were coming up to dock with the Almaz station, and their automatic docking system failed at this point, and they tried redocking several times, and at some point they had to abort the mission. And so rather than docking and spending their time on the Almaz station, they kind of did an early return abort. On the way down, the heat shield didn't come off right in time, which threw them off trajectory a bit, coming through the atmosphere, and they had a ballistic reentry, which means that they're coming down at a much higher angle, a much higher g-forces. It's a very rough ride on the way down, but it also put them about 50 miles off target as they entered the atmosphere. Now, at the same time, there was this huge blizzard just downrange that they ended up in, this blizzard, the storm front, that blew them another 100 miles off range into Kazakhstan. And they landed right on the surface of Lake Timgis, which is in the middle of winter, and right in the middle of the lake, which was frozen at the time. As their capsule hit the top of the frozen lake, it broke through the ice and sank to the bottom of the lake. Now, as these capsules come through the atmosphere, an air valve opens, to let the fresh air in, because they're pretty much almost out of air at that point. But now, in this case, water was rushing into the capsule through the open air valve, and these guys were hanging upside down in the capsule. One of the cosmonauts managed to pull his knife out, cut off his strap so he could get out of the seat at least. Then they started grabbing rags to plug the air hole. And so they were sitting at the bottom of the lake, and this is like, the lake is 20 degrees centigrade at this, or no, it's actually colder than that. It was a very cold lake. And they're out of oxygen also, because at that point they figure they're in the atmosphere, they don't need any more oxygen. And their battery power is draining as well. And so what happened is these guys, for 20 hours, sat at the bottom of this lake. Right as they were about to lose consciousness, one of the guys, who happened to be a submariner, luckily, and understood carbon dioxide toxicity, the problem was it wasn't that they didn't have enough oxygen, it was that the carbon dioxide buildup was toxic to them. And so right as he was starting to pass out, he would turn on the carbon scrubber until his head cleared a bit, and then turn it back off to save battery power. For 20 hours, overnight, they sat at the bottom of this lake until the next morning. An intrepid helicopter pilot saw the parachute sticking out of the ice, managed to snag the parachute with his helicopter and drag it 5 kilometers to the shore and pull it out. And they, of course, expected the cosmonauts to be totally dead, but they had managed miraculously to survive for 20 hours under this lake, and they opened the hatch and they crawled out alive. So it had a happy ending. And by the way, the cosmonauts were denied their flight pay because they never docked to the space station. Anyway, so back to Spore. So we released Spore, and whenever you release a game, what's interesting is that you never quite know what's going to happen, especially when you're giving the community more and more control over that game. In games like The Sims and Spore, the players in some sense own half the development process. When you release the game, you're really about halfway through. We released the creature creator first, several months ahead of the actual game. What I was really hoping was that in the few months before the game released, we would have maybe 100,000 creatures that players had created on our website that would now be pollinating between the players. Instead, we got that meaning in about 22 hours after releasing the creature creator. We passed 1 million within a week. The numbers were just absolutely astounding, overwhelming us. We just recently had our 100 millionth creature uploaded to the website. In comparison, there are an estimated 5 to 6 million species on Earth currently. So, these numbers are almost hard to conceive. And right now, we're actually in the process of figuring out interesting ways to kind of manage this data and index it and do new things with it. In some sense, I think, this 100 million items are not just creatures, but they're also buildings, vehicles, etc. In some sense, I think we have like the largest 3D library on Earth now that the players created in just a few months. We knew that they would be making things like creatures, but they also did things like robots that we didn't expect at all. In fact, early on, we decided we weren't going to put robot parts in the game because we didn't think they would look very good. The players didn't seem to care. They used existing parts to make robots look like robots, when our artists couldn't even do that. They even did humans when we figured, all the things would be aliens. They wouldn't look like humans because we couldn't do, acceptable looking humans. They were very stylized, but still, in fact, the most popular creature in the Spore database is Charles Darwin. We were actually focusing a lot on fantasy, Pixar type creatures, not realistic animals. The players, basically at every step of the way, and if you can look for like, ring-tailed lemur, and there will be, 237 ring-tailed lemurs that the players have made. So just about any type of creature you can imagine, the players, and if you look for Pokemon, it's in the thousands. Plus a lot of things that were just like very artistic and interesting. They found a lot of exploits. They found a way to make disconnected bones and parts work together in a single skeleton by making limbs invisible. So they were actually finding exploits in our system, sharing those exploits with each other. They would tag those things with this tag called creator tip. And if you type creator tip under the search, it would come up with all these weird exploits that people had found. And that's how they were learning from each other. So they were actually kind of catalyzing their learning at a faster and faster rate from the peer group, of people creating this stuff. And then they would write petitions telling us, please don't fix this bug because we like it, we're using it for these cool creations. And so there were certain bugs that we've chosen not to fix because the players petitioned us not to. They didn't really, hurt the game at all. It was more visual. They were even, before we released the other editors, they were making everything in the creature creator. These are all creatures that they had made that actually move around the world like creatures, and they eat each other and stuff like that. And so this is an example of them loving to kind of exploit the system and do weird things in weird directions. Plus, a lot of these things were just art. I mean, you look at these things, they're not that impressive, when they're kind of snapshotted like this, but when they move and they animate, they're just beautiful to watch moving around the world. We have an integrated YouTube feature in both the Creature Creator and the game where people can make movies as they're playing, and then with one click, if they have a YouTube account, upload it. We had like 14,000 YouTube videos in the first week that were thrown on YouTube. They're not great videos. A few of them are pretty good, though. We did a lot of stuff on the marketing side, just kind of experimentally, and we tend to do that, a lot of experimental things, and then we go back after the fact and decide, how useful were they. One of them was kind of this celebrity spore creation thing. We had all these celebrities create spore creatures. Really, the idea was that if they can do it, anybody can do it. So it was almost like the celebrities are 5-year-olds in this sense. But it was actually kind of interesting to see the kind of creatures, and how they kind of mapped to specific celebrities. So you had this, kind of green guy for Richard Branson. I don't know if that's a reference to money or environmentalism. This kind of weird Freedom 1 Patriot Act thing from David Lynch. But in some sense, these are really interesting kind of like doppelgangers and have some reflection. And we wanted these things to kind of reflect the personality of the person making them. As I said, we did a lot of prototypes while working on Spore, hundreds of them. We decided after we released the game that the players might enjoy playing with them. I mean, it wasn't any reason for us not to give them out. So we actually put up a section of our website where you can go right now and download a lot of these prototypes and play with them. And some of these are directions the game did not go, types of gameplay that we thought about including but we didn't. Other ones are little technology kind of experiments. Some are just little interactive toys dealing with certain parts of Spore. But it was interesting, a whole little community formed around these prototypes. A lot of these prototypes were scriptable. So in a text file you could sit there. There was one that was actually for doing cellular automata simulations of galactic dynamics. And so players could not only download the prototype, but they could write their own script files and share them with each other, and basically develop their own little simulations within them. And so a whole little community of people, the more kind of code-aware players, became very active in that community, basically reprogramming our own prototypes. We did other kind of marketing things. We did like kind of a documentary with National Geographic Channel about evolution. We've done a lot of work with the SETI Institute because that was such a big inspiration for the game. And so ongoingly, we're kind of doing things in association with the SETI Institute because a lot of their mission is outreach, educational outreach, where they're trying to get kids motivated and interested in this sort of stuff. One of the more recent things we did is we have this giant database, of over 100 million creations that the players have done. We've actually published an API into that database so that anybody can pull the data out of it and do whatever they want with it. And we're this is an experiment for us just to see what kind of strange stuff the community does when they have access to the database. And they've started doing things like designing their own little, card games, their own browsers in there. They've got their own little iPod applications for browsing iPhone for browsing the database. They're in fact inventing their own little games where they pull content out of the database. They develop their own little kind of browser-based games with it. Some of them are, very elaborate versions of our own browser. And there are a couple of different groups actually prototyping their own card games with different rule sets. And there are a couple of wiki sites, where collaboratively 100 players are sitting there designing the rules for a card game, pulling the data from the database, something like Magic or Pokemon. We had a contest, in fact, for the coolest applications built on top of this. This was the winner. It was an augmented reality demo that actually pulls the top skeletons out of the Spore database, allows you to kind of display it on a webcam in an augmented reality, way, and basically browse creatures and look at them. And this is something some guy did in about a week. This is kind of what it looks like, before you hold your card out and do it. One of the things we actually had in our office, too, that we found we had a lot of fun with was one of these 3D printers, which are pretty nice nowadays. They're pretty high resolution, and they print in color. And so we allow players, if they make something, in Sport they really like, they can come to this website and order the printout of it. And they come out of the printer just like this. They come out in full res and in color, and we just mail it to the person. So these are all kind of experimental things that we're doing, ongoingly with the community. And we're always kind of studying the community. When you release a game, like I said, at this point the community is now driving the direction of that game, I think, more than anything. And the same thing happened with The Sims. We're about to release an expansion, Galactic Adventures, based a lot upon what we saw the fans wanting to do with the game. In Galactic Adventures, we actually have another set of editors that allow a player to go to a planet and build it into a level, into basically a scenario. And I can place items on the planet. I can give them very simple programming, make it a puzzle. I can make it an adventure. I can make it a storytelling experience. But basically, the planet is a little subgame, a mini game that the player designs that now gets pollinated in everybody's galaxy. So now, as you're flying around the galaxy, you come across these planets, and when they call you up on your radio, it'll be whatever message the player wrote, and the player is now crafting a whole experience, a little game that you can now go to their planet to play their game. So this is one of the things that we found the players really interested in doing, and so it's really our first big expansion for Spore. And this will involve pretty much the model was the away teams on Star Trek. They always, no matter what's going on in Star Trek, they have to go down in person to the planet to solve it, and it's like 2 or 3 people that solve it. It's not like some huge armada like in Star Wars or some major technology, space orbit that's solving it. It's always like Captain Kirk talking to this one guy or beating him up that solves it. So really, our Galactic Adventures, we're kind of following that model, but beyond that, it's up to the players. They can, again, craft stories, craft experiences, craft, puzzles. Anything they want to with it. So that's basically my 1 hour Spore talk. I think we have about half an hour for Q&A as well, right? Yeah. Okay. So who wants to start Q&A stuff? Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your input on emerging computer technologies, for example, multi-core and massively parallel systems, and how that's going to change gameplay design and user experience.
I don't think that stuff is going to change gameplay design radically. I mean, that's more of a quantitative thing rather than qualitative. I think accessibility is, going to be possibly a result of that to some degree. There's also, as you move to the architectures like that, you have to look at that alongside of how distributed are these systems becoming. Is it me sitting there with a super powerful processor? I think that we're seeing a lot of really interesting stuff happening in the mobile market. And my iPhone, the one thing about it, I wish it had a processor that was 100 times faster. I'm fine with the memory, I'm fine with the resolution of the output and all that. It's just the processor feels like the bottleneck on the sucker. But I think that on the simulation side, we can actually do a surprising amount. I started doing games back with the 6502, and so a Pentium 5, quad core thing, to me is unimaginably fast already relative to that. But at the end of the day, games are, about kind of an emotional, psychological experience you want the player to have. These high levels of CPU can help that to some degree, but you definitely have diminishing returns on any one axis. In the games industry for the longest time, it was this graphics arms race. Who can have a better renderer? How many polygons can we put on screen? And we've definitely started hitting diminishing returns there. If you look at like the bandwidth going into a game, it's pathetic relative to the bandwidth coming out of a game. The number of pixels and the audio quality and all that stuff that we can flow out to the player is tremendous relative to what tiny little straw the player has back into the game, which is why I think we're seeing a lot of innovative stuff happening, like with the Wii and multi-touch displays and stuff, because for the first time we're starting to address that imbalance. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but...
No, that's good.
Okay. Well, yeah,
I was wondering, regarding prototypes,
Yeah.
if you had any advice or tips about kind of low-cost things that you can tack onto a prototype that add a lot of value. So, for example, with some of those prototypes, the ability to script them, let users kind of make the prototype their own and really bounce things off of each other.
The scripting, it only works for certain prototypes, but the scripting is definitely a huge part of it. Sometimes it's not even scripting, it's just parametric adjustment. If I can go in and parametrically adjust the system without having to program or recompile it, it's pretty easy to teach almost anybody, to do kind of parametric exploration. Here's a game, here are 3 sliders that adjust the rules of the game. Tell me what set you find to be the most challenging. Almost anybody can learn to do that, which saves the programmer huge amounts of time. A lot of times we'll also use the prototype with ancillary materials. So it might be that a lot of the prototype is in fact, just done with cardboard and paper, and the computer is doing some very specific things in terms of resolving the rules or statistics, And a lot of the prototypes I actually do in Excel as a very first step. What can I prototype in Excel? And if I can't do in Excel, what can I do in a very simple, Python thing or a very simple C, code? So really prototypes, the best advice I can give is be careful not to over-invest in any one prototype. It's better to have kind of like 3 or 4 clunky prototypes that give you better triangulation around an area, around a question, than one prototype that you spend, a lot of time just, to determine that, oh, this is not the right spot, but I'm close. I just don't know what direction, So that's probably the best, advice I can give on prototyping. Yeah.
How has the ability to have a huge multiplayer game changed some of the parameters of like open-ended game design? Like what does it make? What do you need to do to make a game fun for people now that you all have the ability to have all these people online at once?
Well, the big question of that is how much do you offload to them? If you look at like an online game like World of Warcraft, you have a lot of people pursuing very different goal structures within it. And a game like World of Warcraft does not get in their way in that it does not prevent them from enjoying their little sub-game. Some people just enjoy building guilds and having social events. Other people want to go out and get experience point and kill, orcs in the jungle. So I think allowing people a diversity of goal states and a diversity of demographics that they can kind of live together in the same box. The early MMOs, player killing was really, it was a given that was going to be the fun part of the game. You get to go in there and kill other people. It turned out that most people did not enjoy that, especially, when you're a new player coming in and the experienced players descend upon you like locusts and kill you every time. So the game's evolved away from that, to where now there are established zones where, you can go kill other players, but for most of the zones are safe zones. And so, in some sense, it's almost like, how would you design a playground, when you know that you have this diverse set of students out there at recess, and some are going to want to go out there and play sword fighting, some are going to climb on the jungle bars, other ones are going to just play in the sandbox. But how do you let that all happen naturally alongside of each other? But at the same time, I think players, they want to have some recognition of what the rules of the system are. And this is what distinguishes something like World of Warcraft from Second Life. Second Life, there really are no rules. It really is just this kind of graphic chat room with people, collaboratively building things and sharing them, and some rough, economic support on top of it. But there's no kind of underlying rule structure like there is in World of Warcraft. So, really, that is more about social engineering, and the game design flows from that social engineering. Typically, you've probably heard of Bartle's types, which is that they've done analysis of online game players, and you have like explorers, achievers, social people. This is basically the clusters of agendas that people have coming into a game like that. And you basically want those people to kind of be able to gravitate toward their own cluster. Let's get together and explore, or let's get together and form a guild, and have them intersect to some degree, overlap to some degree, so the explorers do occasionally interact with the creators or the achievers. But not, so the overlap is a benefit to both sides, not a detriment to either. And so in very kind of rough design terms, I think that's the way you have to think about it. Yeah.
So what's the game design behind the Sims 3 then?
Well, I can tell you from a third person because I'm not involved at all really in the Sims 3 design. But the Sims 3, a lot of the Sims has become kind of a narrative environment for players. They love creating their own characters, telling their own stories. And basically, it becomes this interactive soap opera thing. Now, underneath the hood, there are goals the Sims want. The Sim wants to get married. That Sim wants to have a big house, etc., that drive the drama of the system. Due to technical reasons, in The Sims 1 and The Sims 2, it was a very segmented world. I was in this house or I was in that house. I couldn't just kind of take my Sim out the front door, walk down the street, go down, meet the neighbors, walk downtown. And that's really what The Sims 3 is about, is unsegmenting the world, making the world one seamless palette for storytelling. And including, that also a very diverse set of areas and experiences. So in some sense, you can almost think about it as opening the storytelling space that you can achieve in The Sims relative to what, you could before. Now, this is kind of a more abstract way of stating what the feature set really is, which is The Sims have deeper levels of motives. They have a freely navigable world they can move around in. They have higher levels of social structures, more knowledge of you're my second cousin or my neighbor or my coworker, more elaborate relationships, things like that. But really, it's all in service of the players having a larger palette of potential stories they can tell within the game. Good.
So thinking about these 100 million dudes that people have made, and I'm thinking about this social structure even in Sims 2 that you guys were evolving, and I'm thinking about tourism. I mean, in some sense, the adventure of life is, going to India and finding these exotic people.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just wonder how you think about that whole ability to actually explore these universes you're creating, and how that might be part of some of the gameplay that should evolve for people kind of getting their head around what the whole thing is.
Yeah, it was interesting in Spore because in Spore you're creating a lot of different things. You're creating vehicles, creatures, buildings, cities, etc. We pollinate the world according to what the computer needs. When I go to a planet, the computer says I need 10 wild creatures here and a city over there and 2 airplanes. The pollination rules, in some sense, are driven by a number of factors: who's on your buddy list, what's available, what's highly rated. But it's fairly opaque to the player as to why these things ended up on that planet. And so one of the things that we found, and one of the reasons why we're going down the path of galactic adventures, is that we found that players wanted to craft a larger experience that other people would intersect with. I don't want to just make my cool creature my cool starship. I want to create a cool experience for the other player. I don't know when you encounter my creature if it's going to be you trying to eat him, or him trying to eat you, or you in a starship abducting him. Whereas if I create the entire planet, and here's the backstory, and here's, kind of out of my head, I'm creating a whole little bubble universe that you are now allowed to visit as a tourist. Then they think about what they're editing, what they're authoring at a much different level. They're not authoring one, extra character in the Star Wars cantina scene. They are editing an entire little storybook world that you're not going to come in, and now they control the backstory, they control the rules, etc. So we find that players kind of go down this path where at first you ask them are they creative and they say no. Then we hand them a tool where they can make a creature or something in 2 minutes, and then they start getting delighted the fact that they can actually make something, and it animates and comes to life and it does these magical things. That's their reward. And it's amazing how motivational that is, just that early step. Now, as soon as they can put it online, and just 5 other random people comment on it and say, oh, that's great, oh, I like your turtle. It doesn't take much at all. They get incredibly motivated, especially the people that have never done anything like this before. So it doesn't take much positive feedback or much leverage from the tools to take somebody from I'm not creative to, oh, I'm totally into this. I can't wait to make this cool thing. Now it's a matter of how far down the path can they go, given the tools and the kind of communications environment that you've given them. And so that's where I think we're playing catch up right now on the players, is, we've kind of gotten them running down this path and they've kind of gotten ahead of us. And now we want to kind of run and catch up with them and give them higher level tools so they can craft larger and larger structures and tell elaborate stories and create game levels and all that, which is they're ready to do right now, but we're still wanting to catch up. Yeah.
You succeeded in turning scientific and very intellectual research into successful, mass market. From my experience doing research for Hollywood screenplays, it's very difficult. The famous players attached. What is your magic approach to guarantee success? At the end of the pipeline.
Well, for a lot of it's just brute force. When I was talking about the whole otaku thing, I get so into a subject, and I work on a project for a long time, like 5 years or more. And so for 5 years, I'm, everybody I meet, I'm talking to about astrobiology or whatever it is, until they're sick of hearing about it, But I get lots and lots of data in terms of what if I just bring this topic up to 100 or 500 random people, what is their take on it? What parts of it do they get interested in? What parts, what are the handles that they can grab onto? And now they start feeling comfortable, spinning around and looking at it. And so for me, that's the brute force. Is I talk to a lot of people about things that would seem like esoteric academic topics, and try to find ways. And every time I tell somebody, again, I get a little bit better at trying to kind of convey what's cool about it in language they can understand and making it accessible. Unfortunately, there's no magic, thing you sprinkle on it to make that happen for me. But it's really it's a sense of compression, I think, and that you're taking this thing that's really interesting, compressing it in the right dimension. Typically these things are compressed in their own academic language. If you talk to a computer scientist about emergent systems and how cool they are, and then you start talking about the game of Go and cellular automata and all that stuff, they know what you're talking about. They understand why that's cool, but that's within that language. The average person, if I go up and say, aren't emergent systems cool? Don't you like ants? They don't know what I'm talking about. So what I have to do is I have to figure out, okay, what it is, what is it about ants that they can put their, handle on, and use that as basically the bootstrapping to get them to understand emergence down the road. And maybe they never even hear the word emergence, but at the end of that bootstrapping, they should at least roughly intuitively understand the concept, even though I've never stated what it was. So that's kind of philosophically the way I approach it. But unfortunately, it's just really brute force in time. Yeah.
Yeah, so hearing you speaking about that, games tend to be very far away from the standard game where you have a huge storytelling. Where you know where the climax will be or where the intense moment will be. So how do you judge for a game like Spore what the player will be like very thrilled out or might be interested?
Well, yeah, I think of the things I do actually more as toys than games. But even games, I think, are a very different thing than storytelling. And one thing I've noticed is that storytelling, the most interesting stories to me are the ones that are the most deconstructible. I can pull elements out of them. I can imagine my lightsaber from Star Wars, or the Enterprise from Star Trek, or, basically I can take these concepts apart, and they're very interesting, and make very good play experiences. So now I can go play lightsaber battles with my friends, or, imagine, Cylon, battle stars fighting Imperial, cruisers. The best play experiences I found are inherently generative. Things like The Sims or Grand Theft Auto, it's really interesting when players tell you about what they did. It's their story that they did, and it's unique to them. It wasn't the cutscene that everybody else saw. It was like, guess what I did last night in Grand Theft Auto? Man, I got this cool car, and I managed to flip it 3 times as I went over the Hudson, And so, I think there's this really interesting symbiotic relationship between stories that are inherently deconstructive and games that are inherently generative, and kind of a loop between the two. But I think, at the end of the day, they're both forms of model building. We both use these, to form more elaborate models of the world around us. One through agency of play, one through empathy of story. But so the games I really am interested in are the ones in which the player owns the storytelling. I'm much more interested in enabling the players to tell a wider variety of stories than I am in telling a story. I think if I really wanted to tell a story, I would make a movie or something that's in a more linear media that I can control. Because I think that there's always going to be this inherent tension between, where the player wants to take it and where it has to go because of the director. There's a really interesting thing in terms of drama in general that the reason storytelling like in a movie works or in a book for any kind of linear media is the fact that the director, the writer, whoever's crafting that story knows the future. And because they know the future, they know what the relevant chain of causality is. So, you have to know that the spy is going to save the world to know that, his life is important, and then because he bent over at this one point in time and the assassin bullet missed him because he dropped his water, that the water tipping over was an important part of the story, only because you know the future. And in a game, you want the player to have agency and free will, and you want to basically have the future to be branching out into possibilities. And so if you don't know what the future is, you don't know what the causal chain is that's going to get you there. So you don't know where to put the camera. So you could craft, something like that has an important causal chain, but you can't force the camera to be there without taking control away from the player at every step of the way. So I think games are really, stories can emerge from games. Really interesting, amazing, elaborate stories can emerge from games, but I don't think games are the right place to tell a story from the game creator's point of view. And this is kind of a philosophical difference I have with a lot of other game creators, but, it's healthy. Yeah.
So I loved your quote that models serve as spotlights onto our ignorance. And I was also interested in your comment that when it came to collaborative creation of characters in Spore, for example, or scenarios, that the user's really running ahead of you.
Oh, yeah.
And so putting those two things together, I was curious if you had thought about our thoughts on simulating or modeling this process of collaborative generation, and even with the possibility of people and simulated software working together within these worlds.
Yeah, in fact, we've actually done modeling of our users in fun, interesting ways. I don't know if there's maybe some chance I even have one of these on here. It's funny because we are observing the users very much as generative systems, at different levels. There's the entire kind of social system, the community of our players, within that community, you have subgroups kind of pulling, some that are very tool focused, some that are very kind of distribution focused, building websites, other ones that are more creativity, let's all get together and make cool Star Wars stuff. But so in terms of a generative system, we're not just building the generative systems that generate, the planet surfaces and Spore, but we view the player base as a generative system as well. I'm going to just really quick here. I don't think I have. No, there was a prototype actually we had back of, we were working on The Sims Online. We actually were prototyping the social dynamics of the way players were making friends and meeting people and adjusting their habits accordingly and forming basically, communities and breaking them and the dynamics of the communities. And we were actually matching the model to metrics that we were capturing within the game. But in some sense, we're also capturing metrics on the Spore community in terms of quantifying, basically we have a creativity engine here. Happens to be, several million people on the other side of that engine actually, generating this stuff, but you can treat it as an engine. Because, more and more, especially, I was really interested in artificial intelligence ever since the movie 2001, and I've followed the AI community a lot. And it seems like the way history, or the way, reality is unfolded is an interesting way, because we found that computers are much better at harvesting human intelligence than they are at fundamentally recreating it. If you imagine, Google search results or something like Spore, the computer is really in the role of harvesting human intelligence, condensing and distilling it down to something usable. And it's much better at that than it is at fundamentally recreating common sense behavior or making web linkages or things like that. And that's, what we're kind of doing with something like Spore, is we're trying to, use the computer to harvest creativity, really, in this sense, as effectively as possible, and make it a painless, enjoyable process from the players. And now it's a question of, what can we do with a creativity engine like that at that scale? So, yeah.
So for me, one of the big technical takeaways from Spore was just that, you showed conclusively that 3D modeling does not have to be something that's only done by professional artists, right? That ordinary people can create 3D content that's high quality and expressive, and moreover that they want to do this. So I'm just saying, yeah, I mean, because I know a lot of friends who just love the creature creator almost even more than actually playing the game, which to me is astonishing, right? But so I'm just interested if you could talk a little bit about kind of the way that those tools that let people do that developed, and just what thoughts you have about what are the next things to do.
Well, as I kind of mentioned a little bit, it was not obvious to us at the outset how much AI we were going to have to apply to that task. And it was really studying a lot of failure cases and, understanding fundamentally, it really came down to, the big aha moment was understanding that the Z is the problem. The Z-axis is the hard part. People can totally understand how to draw in 2 dimensions, even if they're not good at it. They understand it. It's when you get to that 3rd dimension and they're basically constrained to a 2-dimensional device and a 2-dimensional screen, that now you have to get into these weird abstractions about, what is my input plane, or, what is my mouse doing? And that's where, things like Maya don't even attack that problem, really. They just take it as a given that there is a modal, shift the player has to make in their mind that I am now operating in a different dimension than I was a second ago. And that's where we found that the average person, that was the curve in the road that most people were going off on. And so we started doing some experimental systems where, more and more, in fact, actually there was that Japanese guy, Takahashi, I think, that did Magic Pingal and Cathedral and a few other experiments. We uncovered his research, and we noticed that what made his stuff a little bit more usable than some of the other stuff out there was the fact that he was trying to apply more computation to the Z problem than existed in other systems, through extrusion metaphors and things like that. But so we basically attacked that problem with much deeper technology, where we were building statistical clouds around the creature, like electron shells, of the computer giving best guessed estimates from several different algorithms at once as to what Z the user intends. So it's trickier than than I'm making it out to be, but it was well worth it. And of course, at every turn of the crank, we would put it in front of somebody, say, build me a horse or build me this. And we would observe very tactically, how did they try to get the leg there? Did they put the leg on the ground first? And, we would stop them and, right in the middle, where do you think that foot is? And we're basically trying to resolve the differences between the AI model and the player's, imaginary model of where they thought their finger was. And, really bringing those two, the discrepancy between those two down was the key to the whole thing. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the deep
ideas you're trying to embed sort of in the games, those mental models that you think that users are actually creating. Do you think that by the system observing user choices and behavior and so forth, you can actually tell or analyze what kind of model, what kind of deep idea they actually get?
I know some people that have gone down that path a bit. I know John Seeley Brown was very interested in that, computer-aided instruction systems. Could you build a computer AI that was actually based upon the players or the learner's behavior, figure out what model they were operating underneath, and then try to rectify it or improve it. I think in certain constrained areas, yeah, that's very doable. It's a matter of how constrained the user input is and how constrained the domain is. There's some point, when you hand somebody a piece of paper and I start drawing some random thing and you don't even know what I'm thinking of, So it's really a matter of how constrained the system is, I think. But yeah, I think that's entirely plausible. I think you can also triangulate a lot from other players. So the larger the data set you have to work with, especially if you have, it's almost like weather forecasting. If I can look at, how this person was behaving in the system, and then how they were behaving in the system, a month later, I can look for a correlation between your behavior and theirs and say, oh, you're likely to go down the same failure path that that person did through, things like statistical forecasting. So I think you can apply a lot of other techniques that make it more accurate if you're dealing with a larger data set.
I'm particularly interested in your constellation influences, particularly with the transcalar or multiscale approach, and Christopher Alexander, Charles and Ray Eames, Case Kuka, and Froebel as well, because all of they were all influenced by or were friends with Buckminster Fuller. So I was wondering if Fuller's transformational geometries or his scale-independent way of approaching architecture ever influenced some of your thinking about Spore, or maybe some of your thinking about multi-scale views and experiences?
A little bit. He was also kind of very modular in terms of, how do you take a simple repetitive element and then turn it into something that solves different, purposes. There were a lot of really interesting design movements that started the turn of last century that really started blossoming around the middle of last century that, with synthesis of different sciences and different design approaches. It was around the beginning of the 1900s that a lot of these design things became professions for the first time. Before then they were apprenticeships. And so there was, at that point, kind of a flowering of theoretical, abstract, kind of understanding of these things that were crossing between art and science, and really it's that overlap of art and science, I think, that is still very fertile ground for the stuff that we're doing here. When you mention these references, a lot of them are from the art side, a lot of them are from the science or the design side. In some sense, I think that's why computer design interests me for the most part, is the fact that I think of all the design fields, it seems like the broadest, because we're dealing with aspects of, video, usability, psychology, architecture, and we can take inspirations from an amazing variety of design fields. It's amazing how much you can learn from things like Japanese gardens, that you can apply to computer games, dealing with, somebody's movement through a landscape and the perceptions they have around it and stuff like that. So I've basically gotten really good at stealing design ideas, I think, from other fields, primarily because the field I'm working in is one that's very amicable to that. But every now and then you come across a designer like Christopher Alexander or Charles Ray Eames that way before their time were very, broad. They thought of themselves as designers in a very broad sense. The Eameses just didn't design furniture. They designed toys and books and movies and all exhibits and all sorts of stuff, And so for them, design was a field. The things that they happened to make, were very specific instances of a much larger abstract kind of idea. And I think, when you look at like Montessori or Froebel, they were seeing design in a similar way, in that, this concept of somebody coming up with constructivist solutions to the world around them is a fundamental skill set that has a lot of application, not just to a designer, but to the average person. So I'm not sure if I answered anything with that.
Well, we're just finding out that Froebel actually, the Froebel method was a method that Buckminster Fuller was taught in, which gave him a huge influence of geometry and the idea that, to understand something and make a model of it, which is really some of your foundational premise.
Well, some of that also, I think, was kind of connected to Piaget in his analysis of childhood development. But it's also been carried on, all the way up to Seymour Papert, and I mean, it continues to this day. So it's kind of interesting that it wasn't just like a fad in education. And in fact, I think it's there's a deeper level that I think that our society has kind of disconnected the idea of play from education, which these are attempting to reconnect. That an undirected kid engaged in what we would call play, in fact, is engaged in a very meaningful educational activity. And so I think there's almost like a deeper level of recognizing, and even Buckminster Fuller, was applying things like gaming to real social issues, for that reason. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we got time for one more question, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody want to have the last question? Okay.
I'm just wondering, have you sort of boiled down based on, you talked about some of the different ways that people, once Spore got out into the world, reacted to it or did from what you expected, like the incredible proliferation of creatures that were created, and also I think there's a mention of how people are actually maybe focusing on the creation side of the game versus the later stages of the game. I'm just wondering if you sort of summarized, how, in a few key points, how sort of the user interaction has differed from your expectations, and what you would evolve in your design process that you talked about from the way that you did things.
One thing I didn't mention that we actually did expect, and we got more than we thought, was what we call basically the penis monster problem. In fact, our whole website's dedicated to what they eventually called spornography. There were these amazing creations, by the way. I mean, they were really good. But within a community like that, we have to give players the ability to mod these things, and if it's objectionable, they flag it, and it gets kind of taken down, at least from our site. The very first thing that was way off the charts, differing from our expectation, was the quantity of stuff that players were making, and the absolute quality level of the best stuff was much higher than we expected. There was definitely this, I think, want from the players to craft larger and larger experiences beyond just a single creature or a set of creatures. They could actually build sets of things, creatures and buildings, and call it a Sporecast and write a backstory for it and all that, and you could subscribe to somebody's Sporecast. But they also wanted to very tightly control the association between these elements. They didn't just want to give you, 20 pretty shiny things, but they wanted to say this is how you set them up in your world. They have to be set up just like this, So I think that, in some sense, they were starting to wanting to build art installations rather than sell you individual paintings. And so that was kind of one of the early learnings on it, and that's kind of what we're trying to respond to right now. I think that our catalog, our Sporepedia, which is on our website where you browse all this stuff, was sufficient for the average person, in kind of a generic vanilla way, but certain sub-communities formed around Spore that had very different search requirements. And so the way you would want to present that 100 million items to those people is radically different, depending on if they're primarily interested in creative storytelling or in recreating all the species on Earth or in some fantasy realm. And so that's one of the reasons why we did the API now, is so that people, in fact, are now building their own search engines into our data set. Because basically, we saw that on The Sims as well. On The Sims, we had this idea of balkanized content, in that we didn't keep much of the content that the players made on our site. In fact, it was distributed on about 100 very large fan sites. You go to this site for these character skins, you'd go to this site over here for these buildings, and the sites would specialize. This site was specialized just in 20-something cool fashions for your Sims. This site was specialized in historic architecture, or this one was specialized in recreating Star Wars, whatever it was. And that balkanized content kind of had its advantages, and that every site could kind of present the stuff in their own way that was totally in line with that community. And so I think that's another thing that we're kind of relearning from Spore, that we never really went down the path of The Sims to learn that in the first place, but we realized that we kind of inadvertently tripped over the right solution, early on. So, okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.